Okay. So I'll just kind of assume that this is everybody that comes, and then if more people enter, I don't think there's a waiting room. Yeah, I don't think there's a waiting room. Okay. So we're going to be talking about framing today. I'm Oliver. I debate at the Nueva School, and I'm a junior. Feel free to ask any questions or email me later. My email's on my wiki. If you're curious about anything or have any more questions. But hopefully there will be some Q&A time at the end. So first, a quick note on vocabulary. I don't think this will really matter that often in your rounds, but like it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I think it's important, especially around, judges that have backgrounds in other sort of debate events. Framing is what most of this lecture is going to be about, and it establishes a mechanism by which judges should weigh or evaluate arguments, typically impacts. There's also something called framework that people usually use interchangeably with framing, but is in fact different, and it establishes the roles and burdens of each side in the round. So a framing argument would be like a soft left or a structural violence argument, whereas a framework argument would be like you have to evaluate the affirmative against some like competitive policy option or something if you're trying to beat the critique or some variation of T, things like that would all be framework arguments and not framing arguments. Oftentimes, there's things that overlap, and we might go into them, like critique rule of the ballots. Some fill sort of arguments might contain elements of both, but we're mostly going to be talking about framing. And anybody at any time can just put their hand up, and I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. So I'm first going to go over like big consequentialist frameworks, and I think it really breaks down into two categories. The first is extinction outweighs, and the second is structural violence or soft left sort of arguments, which is in fact consequentialist and utilitarian in most cases, which we're going to get to. So the extinction outweighs argument is probably the most common sort of like consensus and decision that we come to when we take utilitarianism to its logical extent in debate. The idea is that if utilitarianism would argue that magnitude times probability is, like how you evaluate impacts, then extinction would be an impact that is infinitely bad and should be like the one that everybody at all costs prioritizes eliminating. There's a few reasons why, or like warrants why everybody says that extinction outweighs, and they're all, or like most of them are up here. It's irreversible. A lot of people say you can't like bring back humanity once they've all died. People make arguments about future generations and our importance toward them. People say that it's a prerequisite to having other frameworks. Then there's like these cards that say that it like brings people together. There's a lot of odd arguments here. I don't think any of these are very good. Um, Irreversibility probably is the most redeemable, but like as critique debaters will point out, a lot of things are irreversible. Like when anybody dies or like faces some form of violence, like you can't undo what they have faced, things like that. Um, the future generation stuff is really odd and silly to me because they're not alive, so I don't understand why they matter. Um, the prerequisite to other framework stuff, like, will probably get beaten by a good framework debater. And like, obviously, debating existential risk every day is probably not going to bring people together, which is why like all of the people that are like Bostrom, etc., and talking about this all the time are like, very racist.
Yeah.
Christopher, I think you're not muted. Um, Despite that, though, I think that like it is probably true that in a lot of cases extinction outweighs. And I think the best argument for this is just that 8 billion people dying is more than any other impact that you can come to in debate. Um, so if like there's probably other warrants that you've thought of for why extinction matters, and these are often arguments worth making in debates, but I think in the grand scheme of things, none of them are like hold up to that much scrutiny, which is why, for instance, a lot of parent judges would discount these sort of like extinction arguments. But at the end of the day, like it's probably not worth debating it out. And I am convinced that the 8 billion is more than something else, like argument is pretty convincing. and is a reason why like this is oftentimes just the most logical scenario to go for. Okay. Um, Next is soft left arguments, or commonly known as structural violence arguments. So these arguments would make some sort of claim that a form of violence is under prioritized, is invisible, and exists structurally. We need to make some sort of push against it. There are a variety of different directions that people take soft left arguments. So there's sort of like um, on this IP topic, in policy, there's people that are reading arguments about like indigenous copyright law or like Holocaust remembrance, etc. On the student loans topic, a lot of people talked about racism, and how it relates to student loans. On the biometrics topic, like it's come up a lot. Um, that said, I think there's a few things that kind of align in most of these soft left debates. The first is that if you are reading it, you should make an argument about probability and actor analysis. The reason why this is the case is if you are giving your opponents an equal chance of accessing their impact, and their impact is extinction, and yours is like, I don't know, indigenous IP protection, they will win like every single round. Because like even if you have won that your thing is bad, which is what most of these cards, like soft left cards, say, and I'll go over why most of these soft left cards are terrible. Just saying that an impact is bad does not compare it to extinction, which we have established kills 8 billion people and is probably the worst thing that can happen. And also does probably have larger ramifications. So, because of that, you need to make a claim that their sort of impact is going to get solved for or is much less likely than they think it is. In truth, this is probably a correct argument. Like, there's a reason, again, why people don't take arguments about extinction as seriously in the real world, and why, we've seen people's internal link scenarios trigger and have not seen the impact scenarios trigger in the past. When you are writing a framework like this, you should be focused on beating the extinction outweighs argument. If you are hitting, like if you're hitting a critique debater, you probably want to change the way that your AF is functioning, but I think that's a separate question that I'm happy to answer. Um, but if you're hitting a policy debater and they do not go for extinction, the debate will be very easy. And if they do, you're going to need to beat the reasons why extinction outweighs. So I think you like the best way to do this is to tailor your cards, A, to beating this argument. So talk about why their argument is overrepresented in policymaking. There's good cards that say that like every extra internal link causes it to be less and less probable. Things like that. Even looking at their evidence, most of the cards don't say extinction, and most of their internal link cards have words like might or maybe in them that definitely reduce the probability of these things happening, and you should point that out. That is better than like the Jackson evidence or whatever that's like big threats are a con that like is not true in the case of their uniqueness scenario. If they win, that uniqueness scenario is true. I've used a lot of jargon, so like if anybody needs that re-explained, no worries. But in general, I think that you want to tailor it to beating the specific variation of extinction outweighs you are worried about. And you should also think about the specific form of structural violence that you are addressing. For instance, if you were talking about something like human trafficking, we're going to want to frame that differently than if you were talking about racism. I think that there can be overlapping cards, but if your entire structural violence shell looks the same on every topic, you're clearly not doing something right. I also think that um like these specific cards that talk about your scenario should again not just say your scenario is bad. For instance, the meme evidence that everybody likes to read that is like racism is bad is pretty intuitively true. And the warrants in the card are just racism is bad because it is bad. So I don't understand why people are wasting time on making this claim when instead they could be making claims that say that, for instance, racism is a prerequisite to solving for things like extinction, etc. Um, I think I said most of this on the previous slide. But there's a bunch of different variations of the way that you can take these soft left arguments, and I think that you should all, tailor, specify, and think through the variation that you are most interested in pursuing. Does anybody have any questions on these two frameworks? Oh, shoot. Um, oh yeah. Okay, so Seth points out a good thing. In the chat, I think that when you're in sort of these extinction debates, it's important to note extinction for whom. There's a good DDI lecture by Asia Butler called Extinction Outweighs or Does It that you can find on YouTube, and I strongly suggest you watch. But essentially, I think you need to, or you should press debaters on what extinction means if you're trying to beat them. In most cases, it means extinction for ruling class white people who have had access to institutions that have like promoted their life at the expense of everybody else, whereas people that are in the global south, people that are sort of like marginalized within countries, subaltern communities, etc., have all lived in a state of extinction before. Like climate change, police brutality, populism, etc., are all warrants for things that can cause unrest or extinction, and yet these are happening to communities right now. Okay. Ethan says, I don't think this applies to soft left AFs. These are in the context of ontology claims. I mean, perhaps, but I don't think that that is always the case. For instance, I think that it is true that your desire to reduce something like racism or colonialism, like would erase or would at least prevent the extinction happening to the community that's happening, right? Like the current extinction that is happening to a community. Okay. Do people want me to talk about Phil? I don't have that much experience here, but I thought that like it's kind of related and could be interesting. But I have another section after this that I can go straight into. Okay, I'll talk about Phil. So, these are kind of similar to sort of the framing debates that we were talking about earlier, but there's a few key differences. Usually, similarly to those framing debates, you have a framing contention and then you have some offense. However, whereas with some of these other framing based arguments, you would probably have maybe two contentions or advantages, and then you would have a sort of reason why your arguments matter and outweigh and should be the only thing the judge prioritizes. A like fill-based argument would be a little bit different in that its framing would be a lot larger and would establish all of the impact calculus, establish everything that needs to be prioritized, and the judge's way of evaluating the round at the very beginning, and then just give a reason why you access this. I.e., if during like your sort of soft left structural violence variation, you have set up an entire advantage and then given a reason why that impact scenario matters more, with a fill argument, you have established a method for sort of evaluating arguments as a whole and impacts as a whole, and then you have given a reason why you access this. So if you were to get rid of the framing on a fill argument, you wouldn't have very much of any offense. Whereas if you were to get rid of the framing on a sort of soft left argument, you would still have substantial offense. So in general, the offense is just a link card. There's some like lingo and vocab that people use around this, like meta ethic, standard, etc. I don't like super understand all of it, and I don't think you need to understand all of it or even use it, especially in PF if you want to go for these arguments. Okay. So, all of these utilitarian arguments would be justified in similar ways that we talked about previously. So, we can talk about why utilitarianism might outweigh, but most of the warrants are like, it's what policymakers need to do, or like similar to extinction outweighs warrants, things like that. Um, Cruz says, okay, yeah. So, with your SV question, Cruz, my point is like structural violence is a form, like structural violence framing does agree that utilitarianism is true. And I think this is what most people get wrong with it. I think that when you try to treat it as like some sort of moral claim, it's very hard to win because all of your structural violence arguments say that the consequences of the affirmative would be good or bad for some marginalized population. However, I do think that you have established a way of evaluating which consequences ought to be prioritized. So, in that case, you're like, oh, like the probability of these extinction arguments is very low, whereas our probability is higher, things like that. With the fill case, some of the justifications are close to util, but some of them also are not. So Kant is probably the most popular non-util framework, and Kant establishes this like framework called the or sort of like way of making decisions in the world and in life called the categorical imperative, which makes a lot of claims, but the idea is that it's a universal set of rules that people should follow to be moral. Um, there's a couple components to this. The two that I think are really important, and also the two that I actually remember, are first that you should make actions that would be universalizable, i.e., if I was to cut somebody in line, that would not be universalizable because if everybody cut in line, you would no longer have a line. So that cannot be a good action. Similarly, if I was to tell a lie or to break a promise, then nobody would believe anything that anybody said, and the world would not be able to function. So that is not an action that can be good under any circumstances. The other claim that it makes is that you should treat human beings as an end in themselves instead of as a means to an end. So, for instance, if I was to give my teacher an apple because I really appreciated this teacher, that would be a totally moral and permissible action. However, if I was to give them an apple because I wanted a higher grade on an assignment, I would be viewing the person not as their own individual, but just as a means to get something that I want, which is not an ethical thing to do. Um, I can talk more about debating Kant if people are interested in it. But I think those are like sort of the main thesis points. Generally, you're making reasons why utilitarianism fails, consequences cannot be predicted, things like that. And you're making arguments as to why your moral theory is the best way of making decisions. In general, I think that some of them are relatively persuasive, some of them probably aren't. But I think a lot of the arguments that people think are like a kill shot probably aren't actually that bad. So like the whole like oh, should you lie in like a circumstance where you're like saving somebody's life sounds really persuasive, but like Kant would think that that might be permissible just as long as you are now responsible for those outcomes. And I also do think that people do like kind of well understand that there is a difference between taking an action and not taking one, i.e., if you see somebody falling off of a cliff and you are able to save them but don't, that is probably a less bad thing than if you were to push somebody off of a cliff. Or similarly, when you tell people like the transplant problem, if any of you know it, where it's like the person walks into the like a healthy person walks into a hospital and you can like give away their organs to sick people and it like kills the person, but you save five people who needed organ transplants. Most people think that that would be a bad thing, and they use Kantian ethics, i.e., that could not be universalized because the hospital system would fall apart if everybody knew that when you walked into one, you would get your organs siphoned off. And it has used this individual as just a means to other people's ends, and it has devalued the dignity that exists in every human to make those sorts of decisions. So I think it's relatively intuitive. Um, and I'm happy to talk more about this if you're interested in it. Okay. What's the warrant for why humans shouldn't be means to an end? I low-key don't quite remember, but I think part of it is that human life is an incalculable good. So for instance, if I have like because human life is infinitely good, you cannot weigh between multiple infinitely good things, and thus you should just try to protect individuals' like personal rights and themselves. Okay. Next, we're gonna talk about Hegel, which I think I understand slightly better than Kant, um, and is the like was very trendy for like a hot second in PF, and everybody was talking about it. So Hegel makes the argument that we come up with ethics by working things out together through sort of negation and coming to fundamental conclusions about how ethical life should be structured. Hegel thinks that things like the family, the church, and the state are important institutions for doing this and for going about structuring ethics and moral systems, and thinks that if we were to integrate every possible perspective or sublimate, i.e., integrate the good parts and get rid of, or even integrate the negation of the bad parts, we would come up with a better overall ethical theory. So sort of, I'm trying to think of examples of Hegelian perspectives in life, but it was really popular on this Somaliland topic where people were like, if we integrate Somaliland into the institution of the African Union, we can work out the ideas that they are bringing with the ideas of other nations within the African Union to come to better overall conclusions about how we ought to live life. And I think a lot of implicit arguments people make about, say, the reasons why having an international order is a good way at like stopping violence or why the state is good at implementing rules, etc., and giving substance to the sort of um and like enforceability to the conclusions that we come with. Like people buy into all of those things, and I think that those are all implicitly Hegelian arguments. Okay. How does Hegel answer extinction outweighs? There's a few ways of doing it. First, I think that the like argument everybody likes to go for that's like, oh, we can't talk about things when we're dead is like relatively silly because you have just made a claim that says that is how you come up with ethics, not that you like have made a claim that says that we universally need to do this for all eternity. I think yes, induction fails can be a good answer. But I think there are parts of Hegel that rely on things like consequences, i.e., Hegel has made a claim that consequences will necessarily be good if we work together and come up with conclusions, and they will necessarily be bad if we do not do that. So I think that's one thing is you would say their extinction scenario will never happen, and you preclude them at the link level. Whereas Kant would probably say that even if the extinction happens, you have outweighed it. Here, you say that the link itself cannot trigger because when you work together in institutions, you prevent that from happening. Um, what do you mean, Seth? Like I look at the apple, but I'm sorry, I'm trying to answer questions in the chat. But I think in general, that's sort of the answer to extinction outweighs from a Hegelian perspective. Okay, debating framing. We're kind of like this will be applicable to Phil, but it's mostly aimed at structural violence, extinction debating. And I guess also sort of the like topical role of the ballot stuff that was popular 2 years ago or so, where people were like, the role of the ballot is to like promote the perspectives of women or whatever, which I don't think is like a terribly strategic way of doing this framing debating, but it's probably applicable here too. So the first thing you want to think about is your prep strategy. I think it is more strategic to start with finding your solvency advocates or your sort of impact scenario than it is to start with your framework. So for instance, on the student loans topic, we found really good solvency advocates for things like reducing the racial wealth gap and for reducing what's it called? Um, Reducing recidivism to prisons. Because we found these arguments, we thought it would be logical to read a framing claim about racism because both the racial wealth gap and recidivism are highly racialized and racist within the United States. So we knew that that would be a strategic way to go about this. I think it is less strategic to come up with a topic and say, I want to do this framework because you just might not find those solvency advocates. And even if you do, they might not be as strong as some of the other ones. So you should be open-minded and then narrow down your framework from there. If you're on a topic that doesn't have a very good structural violence push, don't try to go for structural violence. And it is also true that on most topics, one side is much better from this position, i.e., on the student, or like e.g., on the student loans topic, the neg did not have very good structural violence ground. So don't try to go for it in that case. Um, the one other thing that you should do, and this is kind of true in most debates in general, is that you should think backward from your last speech. So from the final focus or the 2AR slash the 2NR. There's a variety of different ways people will read these soft left arguments. Some of them will be planning to give a 2AR on something like a reps K of extinction or death, and some of them are going to be going very heavily on their case, maybe with some weighing, or are planning to go for turns against their opponent's case, etc. You want to figure out what the ideal 2AR or 2NR is for you, and then figure out what the case that is going to best help you with this is and how you want to set up the rest of the debate from there. So again, talking about this student loans idea, this was back when I was like very enthusiastic about weighing, and we wanted to be able to weigh it strongly and perhaps even beat extinction level arguments on their own terms. So because of that, we came and we wrote up a very long weighing overview that we knew we would extend part of into the last speech. We thought through how we would collapse on specific weighing mechanisms, and that ended up being very helpful. Speaking of which, we're going to talk about weighing. So my hot take is that people in PF are like really excited about weighing for seemingly no reason. I don't understand why it is that good. It is just more defense, and it is just a different way of people getting in defense at the end of the round that doesn't make a lot of sense because I feel like judges refuse to actually evaluate arguments and like defense on them. There's a lot of rants and like paradigms about this on both sides of this debate, but like seriously, I do not understand why like we aren't accepting more defense as terminal or close to terminal. That said, these rounds definitely need more weighing because A, judges really think that weighing matters, and B, generally your opponents are not going to be doing that much weighing. Because of that, it pushes you ahead a ton. There's two ways that you should try to weigh your arguments. The first is between things underneath your framing, i.e., like, or e.g., if your opponent is linking in, you want to be able to beat back their sort of link in pushes, and you want to be able to establish why your arguments under your framework are the like most important ones. So these often look very similar to normal weighing pushes. Things like time frame, turns case, etc., are all useful here. Going for scope arguments are very useful here, both under structural violence and extinction. Going for probability is very important in both, but especially in extinction debates. The second thing that you should do is find reasons why you outweigh under your opponent's weighing mechanism. So, for instance, if you have made a claim that says that you would, turn their sort of extinction case and you outweigh on time frame, then even if extinction outweighs, you would cause the extinction faster. So, under that metric, you would still be winning. And I think these sort of pushes are really underutilized and also really game ending because a lot of opponents expect that they can just bash you with extinction outweighs, whereas you can probably still access some impacts under that framework. The same, I think, goes in the opposite direction, where if they can access your sort of methods quicker or like structural violence, etc., fast, that's clearly offense for them. You should also weigh turns. We're going to talk a lot about reading turns. This kind of goes in general. You should weigh turns against the normal argument, both, or especially on the link level, but also probably on the impact level. We'll get to that. So, if you're answering a framing push, I think there's a couple ways to do this. The first is to like isn't here, but you can just actually read a case that operates under this framework. I don't think this is always a strategic decision. Again, if you're on the student loans topic and you're NAG, you probably don't want to concede the framework. Similarly, but maybe to a lesser extent on the border surveillance topic, if you're the AF, you probably would not want to concede a framework. But you can, if there's about equal ground and you have it prepared. But these days, that's going to be, or it's going to be tough if you're just tacking on impacts that talk about oppressed populations afterward, because most teams have like preempts that say you can't link in, etc. Those are really silly, and we're going to talk about that later, but just something to keep in mind. The second thing that you can do is you can read counterframing. This is probably the most popular method, and it's very easy to combine with other ones. So, for instance, if you have prepared a util style extinction outweighs case, you should read reasons why your framework matters more than theirs. And you should be prepared for these debates. In general, I think debaters should be prepared to defend their assumptions, and they should also be prepared to defend the like consequences implementation of the arguments that they're going for. And so if you're going for an argument about extinction, you should probably have something in your files and blocks somewhere that makes an argument as to why that framework is good. And you should prepare and you should work on this every time a topic comes that might be relevant for some structural violence and soft left cases. Generally, these debates are like relatively messy, but you want to develop your own warrants for why yours comes first, and you want to line by line your opponent's warrants. Sometimes people will make you do this in your first speech. This is usually a bad time skew for you, so you should just line by line the warrants as to why you should, and then answer in the rebuttal, and people usually don't give you too much of a hard time about it. The next thing that you can do, and almost always should do, is read turns that function under their framing mechanism. I think that perhaps the best 2AR or 2NR when trying to answer a framing case is to have it be straight turns that apply under their mechanism. In general, most of the topics people are talking about already are very bad. which means that the neg can't get away with much, and also means that the affirmative probably is not doing everything that they can to solve these issues, or, they're relatively small scale, don't affect very many people, in which case, if you are on the negative, there's a high chance things could get a lot worse. In general, framing debaters don't put enough work into their uniqueness, and this can be exploited if you're going for a turn. Note, if you were going for framing, you should have better uniqueness. And if you're answering it, you should cut better uniqueness updates, etc. Um, Cruz says, do you think reading advantages under soft left slash fill and util like people do in LD is strategic? I think sometimes it is. I think in general it's kind of silly. And I also think that like it does reduce the scope of things you can do in the back half. Like if you want to go for a reps K or something, you can't do that anymore. Unless you want to get out with like conditionality murder. I also think that it really reduces the total amount of time that you have, which can be unstrategic in PF. So, like in LD, if you have 6 minutes, you can do a lot more, and you're trying to front load so much in that 1AC because you are not going to get any time back in the back half. Whereas in PF, you have a lot more time in the back half and you have less time in the front half, which makes it a little bit harder to do that. And you like, especially if you're going for fill, like Hegel or Kant take a lot of time to explain, and those are still simpler than a lot of other fill frameworks. That said, maybe with soft left, it could make sense. And even maybe, or like, I don't know, it might contradict a lot of the arguments. I'm not quite so sure, but I think that there could be benefits to it. Um, yeah, could be really useful. Okay. Next question is example of a turn you could use against SV. Yes. So on the border topic, we were hitting the goats, Jason and Abby, and they were reading a SV neg. One of their arguments was about like or I forget what they were, but they were just like border surveillance is bad for migrant communities, etc., which are like intuitively true arguments. But we went for an argument about how vigilantes are really bad for those communities. We went for an argument about how putting in body cameras through surveillance would solve these issues, and we went for arguments about how I don't know, like more oversight helps, things like that. In general, you know, things are already very bad for migrants at the southern border, and we were able to say we could make them better. In reality, would it make it better? Probably not, but like, that's beside the point. Small advantage under Kant. People can see the advantage. Yeah, I think that's kind of right, Ethan. I think it depends on how long the advantage is. Like, if it's a short advantage, they might, especially in PF, they might still beat you on the weighing debate. And I also think that, like, judging just is not quite that good for it yet. But I think it could be really strategic. Like, there's a reason why people have started doing it in LD. And I also think it depends on, like, whether you're going for a very heavy fill push or if you're just more going for, like, trickiness. Okay. The last thing is like linking in. And it's you take your scenarios and you're like, I think there's kind of like two layers of it. There's one where it's like nuclear war is bad for black people too, which is like, yeah, it is, but also, you cause extinction. So like, I don't know, everybody dies. And like also like that's not like a big surprise to the people reading like the SV framework. They're just like, your impact isn't gonna happen. Um, but then there's like also more nuanced versions of it where you say even if our impact doesn't trigger, our thing is still bad for black or like still bad for like oppressed people. So like I think in the case of what is it like in the case of a politics disadvantage, you would be like, it is bad for, I don't know, Trump to get elected for like the same marginalized groups that the soft left argument is talking about, or it is bad because like he is definitely not going to protect like indigenous copyright or indigenous rights anywhere else, things like that. Which would mean that you also access it even if your impact of like everybody nukes each other doesn't happen. Okay. Um, I have like 15 minutes to answer anybody's questions. I have a lot of hot takes about framing, even though I don't read it that much. So I'm totally happy to share them, etc. Okay, yeah, hot takes probably are important. And I've shared a lot of them. So I think like my top level hot take is just that these soft left arguments are not that good. Like I do not understand why people are reading them so much in the variation that they exist right now. It's a huge time investment at the beginning for an argument that just says like bad things are bad. And then like in general, beating that their sort of scenario is going to happen is very difficult because if they have won their argument, like, and you have not mitigated it enough, then they have access to probability. And even if your cards are true in other instances, theirs are true in the case of their argument, etc. But I do also think that like the warrants people go for extinction outweighs are so bad that it can be strategic. Okay, Calvin, you like, as I said, you should probably just answer their reasons why they say that you need to answer in the next speech. That should probably solve enough of the problem. But I think even if you, or I think you could potentially answer it in the first speech, or at least like give some cards on it. But I probably wouldn't line by line everything in the first speech just because that's a bad time trade-off. Oh, okay. I'm happy to talk about this pre-fiat framing. This stuff makes no sense to me. In general, the distinction between pre and post-fiat in debate is really silly, especially in PF, because fiat is not real, and we have agreed upon that. And we've also agreed in most circumstances that what we talk about in round influences what happens out of round. With those two conclusions, I think that everything we say in debate is pre-fiat and does have actual implications on the world. So I think, yes, it is true that you have made an argument and that affects people's subjectivities. But I also don't understand why people think that they should win just for saying, like, talking about some group. There's probably good critiques to be made of this being like, sort of oppressive and or sort of like paternalistic, etc., to do so. And I also think that it prevents people from doing real world activism and change. I also think that like when it happens with extinction and they're like everybody's going to come together, like there's so many thumpers for all of these arguments, and you have prevented your opponent from having an avenue to win the round because you have said that you should win for something you did before they had the access or the ability to speak, which is obviously silly. Soft left arguments, Lee, are structural violence sort of framing, and they are talking about marginalized groups and how to prevent the violence and invisible structures of oppression that they face. I also like some things that I've been thinking about that I think could be interesting are like what role does probability play? Because I think kind of intuitively, like if I was to give all of you the options of like either there is a 1 billionth of a percent chance of nuclear war, or you can like solve world hunger and cure cancer, like you would all pick the 100% chance of solving world hunger and curing cancer. Even if it was like 50% or like something like that, you'd probably still pick the hunger cancer one. So I think that like there's clearly some level at which probability you know, matters. But I also think that, like, as Arch Sen says in his paradigm, if you had a 75% chance of a paper cut versus 74% chance of being tortured, you would always pick the paper cut. So I think we do need to establish better mechanisms for doing probability framing in these, or for evaluating probability in these debates and comparing it to magnitude. Because A, structural violence debaters also care about the magnitude and scope of the structural violence. B, extinction debaters care about the probability of extinction. And C, how we evaluate these things is important. Yeah, Seth is right. It's probably the function of the link debate. If you're interested in reading Set Call, you should read Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And then you should put that into Google Scholar and you should find its cited by function. Um, yeah, you should probably also read Rifkin, but like also just look up like whatever topic you're prepping for in Google Scholar and then like settler colonialism. And you'll probably figure out or find some good relevant stuff. Um, I think even if like maybe Seth is right and Tuck is a Fed, but like it's good reading. They have good stuff to say about decolonization. I'm happy to talk more about settler colonialism if people want, because I have opinions that people should not read it. Um, but This just got off the. This is no longer at all related to framing. Links to reps to alts that fiat. I do not understand what Cruz said. Um, to Seth's question, like none. Like when we read a chaos, there's like a 50% chance they read T, and then like if they read T, the debate is never that developed. Oh, yeah, okay, I understand what Chris is saying. Yeah, that's really weird to me. That people get to link to reps and then fiat something in the alt. But I also don't think that most alts fiat things. Or at least should fiat things. Like I think you've just endorsed something in the round and you have said that by voting for you, you would enable that thing to happen. So then like that kind of gets around the issue. Okay. Um, so Lee, the rounds to watch I think might be a little bit easier. Look for stuff from the TOC topic from 2023, which is what like Durham read. Sorry, excuse me. Durham read a position that was all about structural violence and like they had some interesting debates on it. It's a little bit less in depth than a lot of the recent ones, but I think it could be worth watching. Resources, there's probably articles out there, but I don't know all of them. The same videos that I was talking about. An open case list PF, you want to look at that biometrics topic, then also some of the cases that people read, like Durham, Blake, etc., for the student loans topic last year. But much better than those are the policy soft left arguments. So there was a really, I don't know, currently Greenhill is reading an indigenous copyright position. Um, Northview has read a Holocaust remembrance position. And then on the past topic, liberal arts and sciences, the entire or most of the season was reading a Puerto Rico position, all of which relied on sort of soft left arguments. Baudrillard in PF, yeah, it's probably good. But like I love Pomo and sort of like all these post-structuralist theorists, but it's just so hard to explain to judges in 4 minutes because the judges, like I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, the times make it hard to have a good K debate, but like the judges in PF just don't read. So like A, they don't read, and B, they have this weird PF understanding of all of these concepts, which makes it really hard. Because they don't really understand what you're talking about. And either A, you like gaslight them into thinking they understand it, or B, they like intervene because they think that the K gives them an excuse to do so. So I think you just need to like find a simple way of like tagging Baudrillard because I don't think Baudrillard is actually that crazy to explain. It's just like everybody assumes it's the most complicated position outside of like maybe Lacan and Deleuze. And so because they're like, oh, Baudrillard is so scary, they kind of discount it. So put your tags in plain language and like you should also, everybody kind of has an understanding of what it is, but that understanding is usually wrong. Like Baudrillard is not the Matrix, which everybody thinks it is, and so like kind of beating the allegations I think is important. I don't know. I'm happy to share more stuff or resources, and I'll have an actual critique lecture I think next weekend. So, you know, happy to share more. These were sort of my rudimentary thoughts about framework as sort of like an introduction. But I'm happy to extend it further if anybody wants anytime soon. If there's any last questions, I'll answer them, but I'll head out. If not. Um, AR Baudrillard is or was I think a French philosopher, post-structuralist, postmodernist guy who made a lot of claims about the symbolic and about how information is exchanged and the way that language operates, and it's been a very popular position in debate for a long time. Okay, yeah, he's dead, I guess. I don't like I think that the settler colonialism critique makes very good claims about like the way that society operates, etc. But I think that the way that debaters who are or like debaters often of who are settlers read settler colonialism is a little bit problematic because it is often a pessimistic position and they are making claims about indigenous life even though they have not experienced those things. I also think that it is often a double turn because they assume or they know, like I've read a book titled like Decolonization is not a metaphor, and they've made those claims and they have treated it as a method of winning around. So like, I don't know, just don't make ontology claims to groups you don't belong to. I don't know. I don't like have or my favorite K I've read might be the Kafka position I read January of last year. Um, and we had prepped it for this current February topic, but I don't think anybody got to break it. Um, my I don't know. My favorite author is probably like Deleuze and Guattari. But it changes a lot. Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. And feel free to email me if you have any more questions or reach out to me on Discord. I'm pretty active on Outreach and the PFD. Thank you.